Dr. Langston Hayes, a highly respected black surgeon, faces relentless racism and systemic corruption when he fights to open a mobile clinic for underserved communities. Targeted by a racist police officer, Officer Daniels, and stonewalled by city officials, Langston endures baseless accusations, public humiliation, and veiled threats designed to silence him. As his efforts to bring healthcare to marginalized neighborhoods expose deep-seated prejudice and abuse of power, Langston's story becomes a harrowing battle against injustice. This infuriating tale reveals the harsh realities of racism in America and the lengths to which systems will go to maintain control. The sun was setting over the bustling streets of Chicago, painting the tall buildings in hues of gold and crimson. 12-year-old Mia Perez hurried down the cracked sidewalk, clutching her violin case tightly. She had just finished her after-school orchestra practice and was eager to get home before dark. The cool wind nipped at her cheeks as she turned into her neighborhood, a patchwork of worn-down apartments and small family-owned shops. As Mia rounded the corner, something shiny on the pavement caught her eye. She paused, squinting. It was a gold bracelet, delicate yet bold, with a small charm that sparkled faintly in the fading light. She picked it up carefully, running her fingers over the intricate design. It was beautiful, but clearly expensive. Who could have dropped something like this here? Glancing around, Mia spotted no one nearby. Only the faint hum of traffic and a stray dog rummaging through a trash bin. Her heart raced. This could be worth a lot of money. A little voice in her head whispered, "It could help Mom pay for your music lessons." But a memory of her abuela's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mija, honesty isn't always easy, but it's what defines you." Her resolve solidified. Tucking the bracelet into her pocket, Mia decided she would find its owner, no matter how hard it might be. Little did she know, this small act of integrity would set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. The rhythmic hum of jazz spilled softly from the speakers mounted in the corners of Marley's Diner, a cozy spot nestled on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama. The early evening crowd buzzed with the sounds of conversation and the occasional clatter of dishes. A comforting soundtrack of ordinary life. Dr. Langston Hayes, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, leaned back in one of the corner booths, his long legs stretched casually under the table. He adjusted the cuffs of his understated charcoal gray blazer, the fabric smooth under his touch. His face, framed by a meticulously trimmed beard, carried the calm assurance of someone who had seen much and overcome more. Langston was a surgeon, one of the best in the state, and the head of a prestigious non-profit hospital. Yet he rarely dressed or acted like it. Tonight, he wasn't at the diner for work or recognition. He was here for the pie. "Dr. Hayes, you sure you don't want anything else?" asked Beatrice, a grandmotherly waitress whose apron was splattered with coffee stains and crumbs from the day's rush. She stood by his table, her hands resting on her wide hips, her tone equal parts warm and teasing. Langston smiled up at her. "Just the pecan pie, Ms. B, and maybe a little extra whipped cream if you've got it." B chuckled, shaking her head. "A man as busy as you still finds time to sit here and eat dessert like the rest of us common folk. You keep this up, folks are going to start wondering what you're hiding." Langston's laughter was a rich, low sound that turned a few heads in the room. "I like to think this place keeps me grounded. Can't forget where you come from, B." The truth was, Langston cherished places like Marley's because they reminded him of the simpler times before his name was plastered across news articles and medical journals. It was the same reason he still drove his 10-year-old Jeep, instead of the sleek luxury car his colleagues often suggested. He wasn't oblivious to his status. He simply preferred to keep life uncomplicated. As B shuffled off to fetch his pie, Langston glanced around the diner. A group of teenagers in school uniforms laughed loudly in a booth by the window. Two truckers hunched over steaming plates of meatloaf, swapping stories in low voices. Near the counter, a young mother wrestled with a toddler over a plate of untouched green beans. The scene was ordinary, almost picturesque, but Langston's mind drifted to the other side of the city, where life was anything but simple. He thought of the overcrowded ER at his hospital, the patients who came in because they had no other options, the families who couldn't afford medicine or regular checkups. The weight of systemic inequity was always on his shoulders, even here in the diner. As Langston took a sip of his water, the chime of the front door opening drew his attention. A man in his late 50s stepped inside, dressed in a crisp suit that clashed with the laid-back atmosphere of the diner. His sharp, angular features and the gold watch gleaming on his wrist gave him an air of authority. Langston recognized him immediately. Mayor Everett Steele, a man whose public speeches often championed progress, but whose policies frequently failed to address the city's deep-rooted issues. Steele scanned the diner, his gaze lingering on Langston for a fraction of a second, before moving on. He made his way to the counter, exchanging pleasantries with a few patrons. But there was something forced about his smile, something calculated. Langston watched silently, his instincts prickling. He had dealt with Steele before. Too many times, in fact. The mayor had a knack for making promises that sounded good in the moment, but rarely materialized. Their last conversation had been about funding for a mobile clinic program that would serve the city's underserved communities. Steele had seemed enthusiastic, but months later, Langston was still waiting for the budget approval. "Dr. Hayes," Steele's voice called out, interrupting Langston's thoughts. Langston looked up to see the mayor approaching his table, his smile wide and practiced. "Mind if I join you?" Langston gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Of course, Mayor Steele." Steele slid into the booth, smoothing his tie as he settled in. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone light but probing. Langston leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I could say the same about you. Marley's doesn't seem like your usual spot." Steele chuckled, but the sound lacked warmth. "Sometimes it's good to step away from the office and connect with the community, don't you think?" Langston didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the mayor, noting the faint tension around his eyes. "What brings you to this side of town?" he asked finally. The question hung in the air for a moment, before Steele leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I've been meaning to talk to you about the mobile clinic project. I wanted to make sure we're on the same page." Langston raised an eyebrow. "The same page? As far as I know, it's still sitting on someone's desk at City Hall." Steele's smile tightened. "These things take time, Dr. Hayes. You know how bureaucracy works." "I also know how people suffer when bureaucracy drags its feet," Langston replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. The tension between them was palpable, though neither man raised his voice around them. The diner buzzed on, oblivious to the subtle clash of wills. Before Steele could respond, Bea returned with Langston's pie, setting it down with a flourish. "Here you go, honey," she said, flashing a quick glance at the mayor. "Need anything else?" Langston smiled up at her. "I'm good, Bea, thanks." As she walked away, Steele leaned back, his expression softening into something that resembled sincerity. "Langston, I know how much this project means to you. Believe me, I want to see it happen too. But there are considerations, budget constraints, competing priorities." Langston's gaze didn't waver. "If we can't prioritize the health and dignity of our most vulnerable citizens, what are we even doing, Mayor?" Steele looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Langston thought he might get up and leave, but instead, the mayor straightened his shoulders and forced another smile. "I'll see what I can do. Let's keep in touch." With that, he stood and extended a hand. Langston shook it, his grip firm. "I hope you mean that," Langston said quietly. "Because I do." As Steele walked away, Langston let out a slow breath, his mind already racing with contingency plans. He couldn't afford to wait on promises that might never be kept. The chime of the door announced Steele's departure, and the diner seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. Langston picked up his fork and took a bite of the pie, the familiar sweetness grounding him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he reminded himself, he'd faced worse. But even as he sat there, Langston couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's conversation had set something in motion. Something he couldn't yet define. Langston Hayes left Marley's diner shortly after Mayor Steele, his thoughts a swirling mix of frustration and resolve. The mayor's vague promises and polished smiles had long since lost their charm. Langston had built his career on precision and action. He had no patience for bureaucracy cloaked in empty assurances. As he walked to his jeep, the autumn air cooling his skin, Langston's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing the name of his hospital's administrator, Janet Ford, flashing on the screen. "Janet," Langston answered, his voice steady. "Dr. Hayes, we've got a situation," Janet said briskly. "The city health department just denied our request for the mobile clinic permit." They're citing zoning conflicts and insufficient justification. I thought you'd want to know right away. Langston stopped mid-step, gripping his keys tighter. Insufficient justification? He repeated, his voice edged with disbelief. That's what the letter says, Janet replied. I forwarded it to your email. It came directly from the health commissioner's office. Langston exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. Thanks for letting me know, Janet. I'll handle it. After hanging up, he leaned against his Jeep, staring out at the dimly lit parking lot. The rejection wasn't entirely unexpected. He knew that proposing a mobile clinic to serve low-income neighborhoods had always been an uphill battle. But knowing and experiencing the system's resistance were two very different things. Langston climbed into his Jeep and started the engine, his thoughts already forming a plan. Tomorrow, he'd head to City Hall. He wasn't about to let bureaucratic red tape and veiled indifference derail the clinic. Too many lives depended on it. The next morning, Langston arrived at City Hall, wearing a sharp navy suit, a faint silver watch glinting on his wrist. Though he preferred his more casual attire, he understood the need for appearances. His commanding presence was undeniable as he strode into the lobby, his steps purposeful and deliberate. The receptionist, a young man with blonde hair and wire-rimmed glasses, glanced up as Langston approached. Good morning, Langston said, his tone polite but firm. I'm here to see Health Commissioner Whitman. I don't have an appointment, but this is urgent. The receptionist's polite smile faltered slightly. Do you have identification? He asked. Langston arched an eyebrow but complied, pulling his driver's license from his wallet. The receptionist studied it briefly, his expression unreadable, before handing it back. I'll check with the commissioner's office, the young man said, picking up the phone. As he spoke quietly into the receiver, Langston glanced around the lobby. It was clean, clinical, and bustling with staff, but the air carried an unspoken chill, the kind of formality that often masked exclusion. After a moment, the receptionist hung up and turned back to Langston. I'm sorry, Dr. Hayes, but the commissioner's office is busy today. They recommend you email your concerns and wait for a reply. Langston's jaw tightened, but his voice remained measured. I've already emailed and called. This is a matter of public health. Please let them know I'm willing to wait. The receptionist hesitated before nodding reluctantly. You can take a seat, he said, gesturing toward a row of chairs near the wall. Langston thanked him and sat down, his posture relaxed, but his mind alert. He watched as other visitors arrived, some escorted in without delay, others turned away with excuses similar to his. It didn't escape him that most of the people granted access were white, while those left waiting tended to look like him. The subtle disparities gnawed at Langston, but he reminded himself why he was here. He'd faced worse than microaggressions before. He wasn't about to let this derail his mission. After nearly an hour, a tall man in a dark gray suit approached him. Dr. Hayes, he said, his tone brisk. Langston stood, extending his hand. Yes, that's me. I'm Bill, one of the commissioner's aides. Follow me, the man said, shaking Langston's hand briefly before turning on his heel. Langston followed Bill down a maze of hallways, the faint smell of coffee and paper lingering in the air. When they reached a small conference room, Bill gestured for Langston to enter. Inside, Commissioner Whitman sat at the head of the table, flanked by two other aides. Whitman, a thin graying man in his late 50s, looked up as Langston entered. Dr. Hayes, Whitman said, standing to shake his hand. Please have a seat. Langston sat across from the commissioner, his gaze steady. Thank you for seeing me, he began. I understand you're busy, so I'll get straight to the point. The mobile clinic project is vital for this community, and your office's rejection of the permit is a significant setback. I'd like to understand why this decision was made, and what we can do to move forward. Whitman leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. We appreciate your dedication to the community, Dr. Hayes, he said smoothly. However, there are concerns about zoning compliance, as well as the allocation of city resources. We have to balance many priorities, and unfortunately, this proposal didn't meet all the necessary criteria. Langston's expression remained calm, but his voice carried an edge. With respect, Commissioner, the criteria aren't clear. The clinic would operate within existing healthcare regulations and target neighborhoods with the highest rates of preventable illnesses. If there are specific issues, I'm here to address them. Whitman exchanged a glance with one of his aides, who cleared her throat. There's also the matter of sustainability, she said. Mobile clinics are expensive to maintain, and we've received feedback suggesting that this initiative might not be the most cost-effective use of resources. Langston's jaw tightened. He knew that feedback likely came from people who had never set foot in the neighborhoods this clinic was designed to serve. Sustainability is important, Langston said evenly, but it's not an excuse to ignore urgent needs. This city spends millions on projects that don't directly impact residents' lives. Are you saying the health of these communities isn't a priority? Whitman's gaze flickered, but his expression remained neutral. We're saying we have to be strategic, Dr. Hayes, and while your intentions are admirable, we can't approve every proposal that comes across our desk. Langston inhaled deeply, keeping his composure. He could feel the weight of systemic inertia pressing against him, the same resistance he'd faced time and again as a black man in positions of leadership. The unspoken message was clear. Even with his qualifications and track record, he was expected to prove himself over and over again. Understood, Langston said finally, his voice steady. But I'll remind you that this isn't just a proposal, it's a lifeline for thousands of people. If your office won't support it, I'll find other ways to make it happen. Whitman gave a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. We wish you the best of luck, Dr. Hayes. The meeting ended with handshakes and hollow platitudes, but as Langston left City Hall, his determination burned brighter than ever. He knew the fight was far from over. Later that afternoon, Langston stopped by a local coffee shop to meet his colleague and longtime friend, Ayanna Rivers, an attorney who specialized in civil rights. Ayanna was sharp, outspoken, and unapologetically fierce, a perfect counterbalance to Langston's measured demeanor. You look like you're about to go to war, Ayanna said, as he slid into the booth across from her. I might be, Langston replied, running a hand over his beard. He quickly filled her in on the health department's decision and his meeting with Whitman. Ayanna listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. So, they're using zoning and sustainability as excuses to block a program that would save lives, she summarized. Typical. Langston nodded. I need to figure out my next move. I can't let this clinic die in committee. Ayanna leaned forward, her eyes alight with determination. You don't have to fight this alone, Langston. Let me pull some strings, see what legal angles we can use to push back, and if the city wants a fight, we'll give them one. Langston smiled, grateful for her support. Thanks, Ayanna. I'm lucky to have you in my corner. You're not lucky, Ayanna said with a smirk. You're just smart enough to know who to call. As they discussed strategies over coffee, Langston felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead would be long and grueling, but he was no stranger to hard work. He'd take on the system if he had to, because for him, this fight wasn't just about a mobile clinic. It was about dignity, justice, and the belief that everyone, no matter their zip code or skin color, deserved a chance to thrive. Langston Hayes stood on the steps of City Hall 2 days after his tense meeting with Commissioner Whitman. Clutching a folder full of community petitions and testimonials, he stared out at the small group gathered to support his cause. About a dozen residents from the neighborhoods the mobile clinic would serve had joined him, holding hand-painted signs that read, "Healthcare is a right," and "Support the mobile clinic." Ayanna Rivers stood at his side, her sharp features set in a determined scowl. She had helped organize the rally and was already preparing legal challenges in case the city continued to block their proposal. Her voice was steady and forceful as she addressed the crowd. Today, we demand action, Ayanna declared, her words carrying over the muffled sounds of traffic. Dr. Hayes has spent his entire career serving this community, and now he's asking for something simple: the chance to bring healthcare to those who need it most. But instead of solutions, what has the city given us? Excuses, bureaucracy, empty promises. The small crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Langston felt a surge of gratitude for their support. He stepped forward to speak, his commanding presence immediately quieting the group. This isn't about me, Langston began, his deep voice steady and calm. This is about the thousands of people in this city who can't afford to wait for another study or review while their children get sick, while their parents go without treatment, while they die of preventable conditions. We've waited long enough, it's time to act. The crowd roared again, their passion echoing Langston's resolve. But as he scanned the faces of his supporters, he noticed a few uniformed police officers standing near the edge of the gathering. Their presence wasn't unusual. Protests often drew police oversight, but something about the way they watched him felt off. One officer, a stocky man with a rigid stance and a face etched with suspicion, made prolonged eye contact with Langston before muttering something to his partner. They didn't seem interested in keeping the peace. Ayanna noticed them too. "Stay calm," she whispered, stepping closer to Langston. "They're looking for any excuse." Langston nodded subtly, focusing on the crowd instead of the officers. He continued to answer questions and address concerns, ensuring that everyone felt heard. But the unease lingered, prickling at the back of his mind like a warning. After the rally, Langston and Ayanna packed up their materials and walked toward his jeep, discussing the next steps for their campaign. The sky had turned a muted gray, and a chill wind swept through the city streets. "That went well," Ayanna said, though her tone carried a note of caution. "But I'm telling you, Langston, the city's going to push back harder now. Whitman doesn't like being called out, especially in public." Langston sighed. "Let them push, I'm not stopping." As they reached the jeep, Langston unlocked the door, only to hear a sharp voice behind him. "Dr. Hayes!" He turned to see two police officers approaching. One of them was the stocky man from earlier. His partner, a taller officer with a tense expression, followed closely behind. Langston's gut tightened, but he kept his face calm. "Yes, officers?" he asked, standing straight. The stocky officer, whose name badge read Daniels, stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on his belt. "We need to talk to you about a complaint we received." "A complaint?" Langston repeated, exchanging a quick glance with Ayanna. "What kind of complaint?" "Someone reported that you were obstructing traffic during your little protest back there," Daniels said, his tone dripping with condescension. "That's not true," Ayanna interjected sharply. "We were on the sidewalk the entire time. There was no obstruction." Daniels' eyes flicked to Ayanna, his jaw tightening. "And you are?" "I'm his legal counsel," Ayanna replied, her voice steady and defiant. "And I'd love to see the evidence for this so-called complaint." The taller officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Daniels and Langston. "Maybe we should just—" he began, but Daniels cut him off. "Save it," Daniels snapped. Turning back to Langston, he said, "We're going to need you to come with us to clear this up." Langston's calm exterior cracked slightly. "Come with you? Am I under arrest?" Daniels smirked. "Not yet, but if you resist, we'll have a different conversation." Langston felt a flicker of anger ignite in his chest. He had done nothing wrong, and they both knew it. This wasn't about any complaint. It was about power, about control, about reminding him where they thought he belonged. Ayanna stepped forward, her voice icy. "Officers, if you don't have probable cause, you have no right to detain him. This is harassment, plain and simple." Daniels took another step closer to Langston, his smirk fading into a hard glare. "This doesn't concern you, lady." Langston raised a hand, signaling Ayanna to stand down. He could see the tension building in Daniels' posture, the eagerness in his eyes for any excuse to escalate. Taking a deep breath, Langston spoke calmly. "I'll cooperate," he said. "But you can be sure I'll file a formal complaint about this." Daniels didn't reply. Instead, he gestured for Langston to turn around. "Hands behind your back." Langston hesitated, his heart pounding. The idea of being handcuffed in public, of being paraded through the streets like a criminal, sent a wave of humiliation and anger crashing over him. But he refused to give Daniels the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. As Daniels cuffed him, Langston heard Ayanna's voice rise behind him. "This is unlawful detention, and I'll have both your badges for it," she shouted. "Tell it to the judge," Daniels muttered, steering Langston toward the squad car. The ride to the precinct was tense and silent. Langston sat in the back seat, his mind racing. The humiliation burned, but it was nothing compared to the fury he felt for the injustice of it all. He thought of the rally attendees who had watched him being taken away. What message had this sent to them? That standing up for their rights would be met with intimidation and punishment. When they arrived at the station, Langston was led into a sterile holding area and left in a small, dimly lit room. He paced the floor, the weight of the cuffs digging into his wrists. Hours seemed to pass before the door finally opened, revealing Ayanna and a weary-looking officer who appeared to outrank Daniels. "Dr. Hayes," the officer began, his tone apologetic. "You're free to go. There's no basis for the charges." Langston stared at him. "Then why was I brought in at all?" The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "There was some confusion, I assure you. This won't go on your record." "That's not good enough," Ayanna snapped, stepping forward. "We'll be filing a lawsuit against the department for wrongful detention, harassment, and violation of civil rights." The officer sighed, clearly eager to end the conversation. "You're free to pursue any legal action you deem necessary." Langston nodded curtly and followed Ayanna out of the station. As they stepped into the cool night air, he stopped and turned to her. "Thank you for getting me out." Ayanna placed a hand on his arm. "Langston, they're trying to scare you to shut you up. But if they think this is going to stop us, they don't know who they're dealing with." Langston's resolve hardened. The system's tactics were clear, but so was his purpose. If they wanted a fight, he would give them one, not just for himself, but for every person the system tried to silence. Langston Hayes sat at the long conference table in Ayanna River's office, surrounded by boxes of documents, printouts of community petitions, and glossy photos of dilapidated neighborhoods the proposed mobile clinic was meant to serve. The air was thick with tension, and Langston's mind buzzed with the weight of the last few days. His unjust detainment by Officer Daniels wasn't just a personal humiliation, it was a clear message from the system that his advocacy was unwelcome. Ayanna was pacing, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she read an email aloud. "This just came through from the mayor's office," she said, holding up her phone. "They're denying all permits for the mobile clinic on the grounds that it poses a liability risk to the city." Langston felt his chest tighten. "Liability risk?" he repeated. "What does that even mean?" "It means they're grasping at straws," Ayanna replied, tossing her phone onto the table. "They know you've got the public on your side after that rally. This is just another delay tactic." Across the table, Mitchell Graham, a hesitant but well-meaning ally and city council member, cleared his throat. "Langston, I have to be honest," he began, his tone uneasy. "This is bigger than just the health department or the police. There's pressure coming from people who don't want this project to succeed. Developers, business leaders, even some members of the council. They see this clinic as a threat to their interests." Langston leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking on Mitchell. "A threat? To what? This clinic isn't taking anything from them. It's giving people a chance to live with dignity." Mitchell hesitated, then sighed. "It's not about what's logical, it's about power. If you prove this project works, it'll shine a spotlight on how little the city has done for these communities. That makes people nervous." Ayanna crossed her arms, her voice cutting through the room. "So instead of addressing the real issues, they're doubling down on protecting their egos and wallets. Typical." Langston's frustration boiled beneath the surface, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. He had learned long ago that anger, no matter how justified, was often weaponized against men like him. "What's our next move?" he asked, his voice steady. Ayanna glanced at Mitchell. "If Mitchell can pull some strings, we might be able to get the zoning decision overturned, but it's going to take time." Mitchell nodded reluctantly. "I'll do what I can, but you need to prepare for more resistance." Langston leaned back, running a hand over his face. Time was the one thing he didn't have. Every day the clinic was delayed, lives were at risk. But he also knew that fighting this battle strategically was the only way to win. That evening, Langston returned to his office at the hospital, the weight of the day pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He opened his laptop and began drafting a public statement about the permit denial, choosing his words carefully. He needed to strike a balance between rallying support and maintaining professionalism, something he'd mastered over the years. As he typed, his phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but he answered anyway. "Dr. Hayes speaking." There was a pause before a gruff male voice responded. "You think you can embarrass the city and get away with it?" Langston froze, his grip tightening on the phone. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter," the voice said. You've made some powerful enemies, Dr. Hayes. If I were you, I'd think twice before stirring up more trouble. The line went dead before Langston could respond. He stared at the phone, his pulse quickening. It wasn't the first time he'd received veiled threats, but something about the tone, the deliberate menace, made this one feel different. Langston took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. He couldn't let fear derail him. Instead, he grabbed his coat and headed for Ayana's office. She needed to know about this immediately. Ayana's reaction was predictably fiery. "This is intimidation, plain and simple," she said, pacing furiously. "They're trying to scare you into backing down." Langston nodded, his expression resolute. "It won't work, but we need to be prepared for whatever they try next." Ayana stopped pacing and turned to face him. "Langston, I know you're determined, but you need to be careful. These people aren't playing fair. If they can't beat you with bureaucracy, they'll resort to other tactics." "I know," Langston said quietly, "but I can't walk away from this. Too many people are counting on me." Ayana studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Fine. But we're going on the offensive. If they want to play dirty, we'll expose them for what they are." The next day, Langston and Ayana held a press conference on the hospital steps, flanked by community leaders and local activists. Langston spoke with the same measured authority that had earned him respect across the city. "This fight isn't about politics or personal ambition," he said, addressing the crowd of reporters. "It's about saving lives. The people of this city deserve better than empty promises and systemic neglect. We will not be silenced, and we will not back down." The press conference drew significant media attention, and within hours, social media was flooded with messages of support for the mobile clinic, but the backlash was swift. Anonymous online accounts began spreading false allegations about Langston, accusing him of financial impropriety and questioning his motives. Ayana called him that evening, her voice tight with frustration. "They're trying to discredit you. I've already filed takedown requests for some of the posts, but this is going to get ugly." Langston exhaled slowly, his resolve hardening. "Let them throw everything they have, we'll counter it with the truth." The breaking point came 3 days later. Langston was leaving a meeting with hospital staff when he was stopped by Officer Daniels, who stood waiting near the hospital entrance. 2 other officers flanked him, their expressions cold and impersonal. "Dr. Hayes," Daniels said, his tone mockingly polite. "We need to have a word." Langston's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "What is this about?" Daniels smirked. "You're under investigation for embezzlement. We have a warrant to search your office." Langston felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "That's ridiculous. I've done nothing wrong." Daniels shrugged. "We'll see about that." As the officers entered the hospital, Langston stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. This wasn't just an attack on him, it was an attack on everything he stood for. They were trying to destroy his reputation, to undermine his credibility, to erase everything he'd built. But Langston wasn't about to let them win. That evening, Langston and Ayana sat in her office, reviewing the events of the day. Ayana's jaw was set, her eyes blazing with fury. "This is corruption at its finest," she said. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore." Langston nodded. "They want me to react, to make a mistake they can use against me, but I won't give them the satisfaction." Ayana leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "Langston, we need to turn this around. Let's hold another press conference, but this time, we expose everything, the threats, the baseless investigation, all of it. If they want a fight, we'll give them one." Langston met her gaze, his determination unwavering. "Let's do it." As they finalized their plans, Langston couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes had never been higher. The system had thrown everything at him. Threats, lies, humiliation. But he was still standing. And now, he was ready to fight back with everything he had. The community center gymnasium buzzed with nervous energy as reporters jostled for position near the stage. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly with activists, local residents, and hospital staff, their faces a mix of anticipation and resolve. Langston Hayes stood just off stage, his heart pounding. He straightened his tie, glanced at Ayana Rivers, and took a deep breath. "They're going to come at you hard," Ayana said, her voice low but firm. "Stick to the facts, call out their lies, and don't let Daniels bait you. You've got this." Langston nodded, her words grounding him. This wasn't just another press conference. It was a battle for his reputation, his community, and everything he'd worked for. The stakes had never been higher. Ayanna stepped to the microphone first, calling the room to order. "Good evening, everyone," she began. "Tonight, we're here to address the blatant abuse of power that's been used to silence one of this city's most dedicated advocates. Dr. Langston Hayes has been accused of crimes he did not commit, by a system more interested in protecting its own than serving the people. Tonight, the truth comes out." The room erupted into applause, and Langston stepped onto the stage. The crowd quieted as he took the microphone, his calm but commanding presence drawing every eye. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "In the past week, I've been accused of embezzlement, harassed by law enforcement, and subjected to baseless investigations. But let me be clear, this is not about me. This is about a broken system that would rather discredit those who challenge it than address the real issues facing our community." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd, and Langston continued. "I've dedicated my career to serving this city, not for recognition, not for profit, but because I believe in the dignity of every human life. The mobile clinic project threatens no one except those who benefit from keeping healthcare inaccessible, and I will not stop fighting for it." Before he could continue, the back doors slammed open. Officer Daniels strode into the gym, flanked by two other officers, his presence immediately shifting the room's energy. Gasps and murmurs spread as Daniels, his hand resting on the baton at his hip, marched toward the stage. Langston locked eyes with Daniels, his chest tightening. This was no coincidence. Daniels stopped just in front of the stage, his smirk visible even from a distance. "Dr. Hayes," he called out, his voice loud enough to echo through the gym. "Don't let me interrupt your show." Langston stepped closer to the edge of the stage, gripping the microphone. "You're not interrupting, Officer Daniels. In fact, I'm glad you're here. The people of this city deserve to see the lengths some will go to protect their power." Daniels chuckled, his gaze sweeping the room. Power. That's a funny word coming from someone who thinks he's above the law. A few reporters snapped photos, their flashes punctuating the tension. Langston's grip tightened on the microphone, but his voice remained steady. "The only thing I'm above, Officer Daniels, is the corruption and intimidation tactics you've used against me and my team. You've fabricated evidence, harassed my staff, and detained me without cause. And now, you're here to escalate this further." Daniel's smirk faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. "Big words for a man under investigation. Maybe you'd like to explain how those missing hospital funds ended up in your personal account." The crowd gasped, but Langston didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled a folder from the podium and held it up. "I'm glad you brought that up. This is a forensic audit of every transaction made through the hospital's accounts during my tenure. It was conducted independently by one of the top accounting firms in the state." He opened the folder, pulling out a highlighted document. "And here's the kicker. The funds you claim were embezzled were actually transferred to a community outreach fund months ago. With full approval from the hospital board, your accusation isn't just baseless, it's blatantly false." A murmur of shock spread through the audience as reporters scribbled notes and cameras clicked furiously. Daniel's jaw tightened, his confidence wavering for the first time. Langston pressed on. "But let's talk about real corruption, Officer Daniels. Should we discuss the complaint filed against you last year for excessive force, or the internal memo I obtained showing how your precinct dismissed over a dozen misconduct cases to protect its image?" Daniel's face reddened, and he stepped closer to the stage, his voice rising. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," Langston replied, his voice unwavering. "And so does everyone else now." The crowd erupted into applause, and Langston took a step back, letting the noise wash over him. Daniels, visibly shaken, looked around the room as if searching for an escape. But before he could retreat, Ayanna stood and addressed the reporters directly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, this is what systemic corruption looks like. A police officer abusing his position to silence a man fighting for justice. I encourage you all to ask yourselves, who stands to gain from these lies, and why?" Daniels scowled, his composure crumbling. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the gym, his two officers trailing behind him. The doors slammed shut behind them, leaving the room buzzing with energy. Langston stepped back to the microphone. "This fight isn't over," he said, his voice carrying over the cheers. "But tonight, we've taken a stand together. We can create a city where justice and integrity prevail. Thank you." Later that evening, Langston sat in Ayana's office, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally fading. Ayana poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to him, her expression a mix of pride and exhaustion. "You were brilliant up there," she said, clinking her glass against his. Langston smiled faintly, but his mind was still racing. "It's not over. Ayana Daniels won't let this go, and neither will the people pulling his strings." "No, they won't," Ayana agreed. "But now, the whole city is watching. They can't operate in the shadows anymore." Langston nodded, her words offering some comfort. But as he stared out the window at the city lights, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead. The courthouse steps were slick from a steady drizzle, the air heavy with the smell of wet concrete and the buzz of anticipation. A crowd of reporters and onlookers gathered below, their cameras poised and questions flying. Langston Hayes stood at the top of the stairs, his breath steady despite the storm brewing around him. Today was the day. Inside the courthouse, Ayana Rivers strode beside him, her sharp heels clicking on the polished marble floors. "You know Daniels will try to control the narrative," she said quietly. "If this goes sideways—" "It won't," Langston interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "They've underestimated us every step of the way. That ends today." Ayana nodded, though her eyes flickered with concern. Together, they entered the courtroom, where Officer Daniels sat at the defendant's table. His uniform was crisp, his expression hard. Beside him was his attorney, a man known for defending police officers in controversial cases. Daniels leaned back in his chair, his smirk faint but palpable. The room was packed. Community members, reporters, and city officials all crowded into the benches. The tension-electric Langston took his seat at the plaintiff's table, Ayana by his side, their case files stacked neatly in front of them. As the judge entered and called the room to order, Langston's focus sharpened. This was it. The moment to expose Daniels for what he was. The trial unfolded with a meticulous rhythm. Ayana began by presenting a detailed account of Daniels' history. Complaints filed against him for excessive force, internal memos revealing attempts to suppress misconduct allegations, and testimonies from fellow officers who had witnessed his behavior. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture, and the crowd murmured with every new revelation. Daniels's attorney attempted to deflect, claiming the complaints were baseless and part of a larger, anti-police agenda. But Ayana was relentless. "Let's talk about the night Dr. Hayes was detained," Ayana said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "Officer Daniels, you claim to have received a complaint about Dr. Hayes obstructing traffic during a peaceful rally. Can you provide the name of the complainant?" Daniels shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering. "It was anonymous," he said flatly. "How convenient," Ayana replied, raising an eyebrow. "And yet, you deemed it sufficient grounds to detain Dr. Hayes without evidence or cause. Is that standard procedure?" Daniels' attorney objected, but the judge allowed Ayana to continue. She pressed on, her questions peeling back the layers of Daniels' actions until his veneer of authority began to crack. Finally, it was Langston's turn to take the stand. The courtroom fell silent as Langston adjusted the microphone. He met Daniels' gaze, unflinching, then turned to the jury. "My name is Dr. Langston Hayes," he began. "I've spent my life serving this community as a surgeon and advocate. I believe in the power of justice. But what happened to me that night was not justice, it was abuse of power." Langston described the events of his detainment in calm, measured tones. He spoke about the threats he'd received, the baseless accusations, and the systemic barriers he'd faced, but he didn't stop there. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "It's about every person in this city who has been silenced, marginalized, or intimidated by the very system meant to protect them. Officer Daniels is not an isolated case, he's a symptom of a deeper problem." Daniels shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Langston pressed on, his words striking with the precision of a scalpel. "We cannot allow fear and corruption to dictate how we live," Langston concluded. "The people of this city deserve better, They deserve accountability. As Langston stepped down from the stand, Ayanna leaned over and whispered, "That was incredible." But the battle wasn't over yet. Daniels's attorney called him to the stand next. The officer swaggered to the witness box, his expression hardening into a mask of defiance. "Officer Daniels," the attorney began, "you've been accused of targeting Dr. Hayes due to his activism and community work. How do you respond to these allegations?" Daniels leaned into the microphone. "I did my job," he said firmly. "Dr. Hayes thinks he's above the law, he wanted to make a spectacle, and I wasn't about to let that happen." Ayanna's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, waiting for her chance. When Daniels's attorney finished, she stood, her heels echoing loudly as she approached the stand. "Officer Daniels," she began, her voice steady. "Do you believe everyone in this city deserves equal treatment under the law?" Daniels hesitated. "Of course." "And yet," Ayanna continued, flipping through a file, "you've received multiple complaints from black residents accusing you of excessive force and racial profiling. Can you explain that?" Daniels bristled. "Those complaints were unfounded." Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "Unfounded, or ignored, because according to this memo," she held up a document, "your department dismissed these complaints without a formal investigation." Daniel's face reddened, but he said nothing. Ayanna pressed on, her questions growing sharper, each one chipping away at his credibility. Finally, she delivered the blow that silenced the room. "Officer Daniels," she said, holding up a transcript of a recorded conversation, "are you familiar with these words? 'That guy thinks he's some kind of hero, but I'll show him who's really in charge'?" Daniels froze, his eyes widening slightly. Ayanna turned to the jury. "This is a direct quote from Officer Daniels, recorded by one of his own colleagues. It was said on the night Dr. Hayes was detained." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the revelation sending shockwaves through the room. Daniels' attorney objected, but the damage was done. As the trial concluded, Langston felt a mix of exhaustion and vindication. The jury had yet to deliberate, but the tide had clearly turned. The community's support was stronger than ever, and Daniel's actions had been laid bare for all to see. Outside the courthouse, Langston and Ayanna faced a sea of reporters. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward them. "Dr. Hayes," one reporter called, "how do you feel about today's proceedings?" Langston met the reporter's gaze, his voice steady. "I feel hopeful. Today was a step toward justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has been silenced by systemic injustice. The fight isn't over, but we're moving forward." As he spoke, a figure lingered at the edge of the crowd. Langston recognized Mitchell Graham, the city council member, who had initially hesitated to take a stand. Their eyes met, and Mitchell gave him a small nod of respect before slipping away. Langston turned back to the cameras, his resolve stronger than ever. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he would not back down. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats, the foreman clutching a folded piece of paper that would determine the outcome of the trial. Langston Hayes sat beside Ayanna Rivers, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The anticipation in the air felt almost suffocating. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman replied. Langston glanced at Ayanna, whose expression betrayed no hint of doubt. She had fought tirelessly for this moment, and now, their fate rested in the hands of 12 strangers. The foreman unfolded the paper, cleared his throat, and spoke. "On the matter of Officer Daniels' misconduct and abuse of authority, we find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of relief and approval. Langston closed his eyes briefly, allowing the weight of the decision to settle over him. Justice had been served, not just for himself, but for the community that Daniels had terrorized for years. Daniels' conviction sent shockwaves through the city. For years, his abuses of power had been shielded by a web of systemic corruption, but Langston's courage and Ayanna's relentless advocacy had torn down that facade. Within days, additional investigations were launched into the precinct, uncovering a pattern of misconduct that extended far beyond Daniels. Several officers were suspended, and the police chief announced his resignation under mounting public pressure. The health department, too, faced scrutiny. The revelations from the trial forced Commissioner Whitman to address the blatant bias in denying permits for Langston's mobile clinic under threat of a lawsuit. The city reversed its decision, granting full approval for the clinic to begin operations. On the steps of City Hall, Langston stood before a crowd of supporters and reporters, holding the official permit in his hand. Beside him were Ayanna, Mitchell Graham, and several community leaders who had rallied to his cause. "This isn't just a victory for the clinic," Langston said, his voice carrying over the cheers. "It's a victory for every person in this city who has been told their voice doesn't matter, that their lives don't matter. This is proof that when we stand together, we can create change." The crowd erupted into applause, their chants of "Justice for all" echoing through the streets. In the weeks that followed, Langston threw himself into preparing the mobile clinic for its launch. Despite the victory, he knew there was still much work to be done. The clinic was a first step, a tangible symbol of hope, but systemic change required sustained effort. Through it all, Langston found himself reflecting on how the ordeal had changed him. He had always considered himself resilient, but the trial had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had faced public humiliation, threats, and moments of doubt that nearly broke him. But standing at the other side of the storm, he realized he was stronger than he'd ever thought possible. One evening, as he walked through the nearly completed clinic, he paused to look at the name etched above the entrance. The Hayes Harper Clinic for Community Health, a tribute to his late parents, whose unwavering belief in integrity had shaped his life. Langston smiled, his chest swelling with pride. This wasn't just a building, it was a legacy, a promise to future generations that they would not be forgotten. The ripple effects of Langston's victory extended far beyond the clinic. The trial and its aftermath had sparked a broader conversation about accountability in the city's institutions. Activists demanded greater oversight of the police department, leading to the formation of an independent review board. With community representatives, new policies were enacted to ensure equitable access to city resources, and more leaders like Mitchell Graham began stepping forward to champion reform. Langston's story also inspired others to take action. At a town hall meeting weeks later, a young woman stood and shared her own experience of discrimination, her voice trembling but resolute. "Because of you, Dr. Hayes," she said, "I finally feel like I can speak up." Hearing those words, Langston felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His fight had never been about personal glory. It was about empowering others to believe in their own worth and their ability to create change. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Langston visited Marley's Diner, the place where his journey had taken its unexpected turn. Beatrice greeted him with a wide grin as she set a slice of pecan pie in front of him. "You've earned this, Dr. Hayes," she said, patting his shoulder. Langston chuckled, his smile tinged with gratitude. As he ate, he glanced around the diner, observing the familiar hum of conversation and the sense of community that had always anchored him. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to exhale fully. Before leaving, he approached Beatrice at the counter. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for always reminding me where I come from." Beatrice waved him off, but her eyes shone with pride. "Oh, honey, we've always known you were going to do something big. You just needed to believe it yourself." As Langston walked to his car, his phone buzzed with a new email. It was from a national nonprofit offering to partner with his clinic to expand its services. Statewide, Langston's eyes widened as he read the message, his mind already racing with possibilities. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more resistance. But he was ready. The fight for justice and equity wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon, and Langston was determined to see it through. As he started the engine and pulled onto the street, the city stretched out before him, a place of struggle, resilience, and hope. Langston Hayes had faced the worst the system could throw at him, and he had emerged stronger, not just for himself, but for the countless lives he was determined to uplift. The Hayes Harper Clinic would open its doors in 2 weeks, but Langston knew this was only the beginning, and beginnings, he thought with a quiet smile, were his specialty. Langston Hayes stood on the front steps of the Hayes Harper Clinic, the morning sun casting long shadows across the freshly painted sign. The first patients were scheduled to arrive within the hour, and the energy inside was palpable. Nurses double-checking supplies, volunteers arranging chairs in the waiting area, and community members gathering outside to witness the clinic's historic opening. For Langston, this moment was the culmination of months of struggle, resilience, and unyielding belief in the power of integrity. As he watched a group of children playing tag on the sidewalk nearby, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he, and the community, had come. Langston had always been a man of conviction, but his battle against systemic corruption had pushed him to his limits. He had faced humiliation, threats, and public scrutiny. There were moments of doubt when he questioned whether the fight was worth the toll it took on him, both personally and professionally. Yet through it all, he had remained steadfast, driven by a deeper purpose: the belief that every person deserved dignity, access, and opportunity. This ordeal had changed Langston in ways he hadn't expected. He had always valued hard work and resilience, but now he understood the importance of collaboration and trust. Ayanna's relentless advocacy, the community's unwavering support, and even the hesitant allies like Mitchell Graham, had shown him that collective action was the key to dismantling entrenched systems of power. Langston no longer saw himself as just a surgeon or an advocate. He was part of a larger movement, one that demanded justice and refused to back down. And yet Langston knew that this was not the end of the fight. The clinic was a milestone, not a finish line. He had plans to expand its services, partnering with schools, shelters, and faith organizations to reach even more people. He wanted to create internships for young medical students from underrepresented communities, ensuring that the next generation of doctors and advocates would have the tools they needed to continue the work. But Langston also understood the need for balance. He had learned to lean on his team, to trust others to share the load. This wasn't a battle he could, or should, fight alone. Langston's struggle was deeply personal, but it also reflected a broader societal truth. Systemic racism and abuse of power were not isolated incidents, but pervasive forces that affected countless lives. Officer Daniels was a single cog in a much larger machine, one that thrived on fear, intimidation, and silence. His conviction was a victory, but it was just the beginning of a long overdue reckoning. The trial and its aftermath had exposed not only Daniels' misconduct, but also the city's failure to address inequities in policing, healthcare, and resource allocation. For years, neighborhoods like the one Langston's clinic now served had been neglected, left to crumble under the weight of poverty, disinvestment, and systemic barriers. But Langston's story had also shown what was possible when people stood together. The public outcry that followed his trial forced the city to reevaluate its priorities. The creation of an independent police oversight board, the restructuring of the health department, and increased funding for community-led initiatives were all signs of progress. They were imperfect and incomplete, but they were steps in the right direction. Langston often thought about the young woman who had spoken up at the town hall meeting, inspired by his fight. Her courage was a reminder that change didn't require perfection, it required action. Every voice, every step forward, every challenge to the status quo added momentum to the movement for justice. Langston's journey was far from over, but it was proof that progress was possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. His story carried a powerful message. Resilience and integrity were not just individual virtues, but collective forces that could transform communities. For those watching from the sidelines, Langston's fight was a call to action. It was a reminder that systemic change didn't happen overnight, nor did it come from one person alone. It required the courage to speak out, the willingness to listen, and the determination to keep going, even when the path was steep. Langston often thought about his parents, whose values had shaped his life. His father, a schoolteacher, had once told him, "The measure of a man isn't what he achieves for himself, but what he builds for others." Those words had stayed with Langston, guiding him through his darkest moments. Now, as he looked at the clinic, bustling with activity, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had built something that mattered, not just for himself, but for the community he loved. As the first patients arrived, Langston greeted them with a warm smile. An elderly woman held his hand tightly as she thanked him for bringing the clinic to their neighborhood. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at the colorful mural painted on the clinic's wall, a vibrant depiction of unity and hope created by local artists. Inside, Langston found Ayanna overseeing the final preparations. She looked up and gave him a knowing smile. You did it, she said simply. We did it, Langston corrected, his voice full of gratitude. Ayanna nodded, her eyes softening. Ready for the next battle? Langston chuckled. Always. As the day went on, Langston took a moment to step outside and breathe in the fresh air. The street was alive with activity, a reflection of the resilience and determination that had carried them all through the storm. He thought about the people who had supported him, the obstacles they had overcome, and the work still left to do. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The Hayes Harper Clinic stood as a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept injustice. Its impact would ripple far beyond the walls of the building, touching lives and inspiring change in ways Langston could only begin to imagine. But the fight for equity was far from over. Langston knew that systemic problems required systemic solutions, and he was ready to take the next steps. He had already begun organizing a coalition of community leaders, activists, and policymakers to push for broader healthcare reforms. His vision extended beyond the clinic. He dreamed of a city where every person had access to the resources and opportunities they needed to thrive. As Langston walked back inside, he felt a quiet but unshakable determination. The road ahead would be long, but he wasn't walking it alone. Together, they would build a future that honored the dignity of every person, a future where justice was not just an aspiration, but a reality. And as the clinic doors opened for the first time, Langston knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. With hope, resilience, and a community united in purpose, Langston Hayes had turned his fight into a movement, a testament to the power of standing up, speaking out, and never giving up.